Welcome to the Broken Graciously podcast, where we challenge the culture of brokenness by exchanging beauty for ashes holistically, with candid conversations, transparency, and practical tips. I'm your host, Tanisha B. Lester, lovingly known as Coach T. I'm a Master Certified Life and Business Coach, Certified Christian Coach, Certified Pastoral Counselor, and published author. I look forward to engaging with you in the comments as well as on IG. Follow me on IG at Tanisha B. Lester with the number 1. Please like and subscribe to this podcast. Welcome to another episode of Broken Graciously, where we challenge the culture of brokenness holistically with transparent conversations, practical tips, and candidness. So this is Coach T, and this is episode 10. This is the final episode of season 1 of the podcast. Woo! This has been really great. And in all honesty, I will say this has been easier than I thought it would be. Sometimes it was a little challenging, but yeah, it's more than what I expected to occur. So first, let me say before we dive in, thank you to everyone who has listened, who have downloaded, and followed the podcast. I truly appreciate you. So let's get into just basically a recap of all of the things that we've talked about over the last 10 episodes. We've talked about fear. We've talked about giving up our timelines. We've talked about forgiveness of self. We've talked about forgiveness of others. We've talked about trauma. We've talked about arrested development and what that means from a psychological standpoint. We've talked about many things, and I have shared with you literally different scenarios and situations that I found myself in, or even that I've walked through. And that's just a part of who I am as far as just being open and honest about different things. I recall many times just feeling shameful and feeling guilty about situations either that I found myself in, or that I found that others may have played a part in me being in that particular place. But what it all culminated to was that I needed to take responsibility for everything that I felt. I needed to take responsibility for my own actions and even my inactions. And that was literally where I needed to be and what I needed to do. So I think where I'm actually going with this in this very moment of clarity is sitting in a place of being a victim. Now, hear me when I say, yes, things may have happened to you just as well as things happened to me. And they may have been things that were out of your control that literally placed you in the space of being a victim of circumstances or individuals, whether that's their actions, whether their actions were intentional or unintentional. I'm not saying that you weren't a victim. I too was a victim. But when we begin to think about and talk about and reference the victim mentality, that's a space in which we have choice. We have choice. We have freedom, and we can make a different choice. But oftentimes, because that victim mentality sits on us so hard and so deep, we don't see the possibility of looking from a different perspective or even reframing our stories. That's where I want you to look at this entire podcast, the coming seasons, and even this season, the culmination of it right now. I want you to begin to see that no matter how situations in your life played out, you do not have to remain as a victim. You can reclaim your power, you can reclaim your story so that that perspective of being a victim shifts and falls off of you. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, from my perspective, right? And you can plug yourself into a similar context, whatever your particular context was. Here's my context. My context was I was sexually abused and molested from a very early age. And it shaped how I looked at everything. It shaped how I viewed life. It shaped how I moved through life. It shaped relationships with family. It shaped relationships with men, like my child. Like, it shaped everything. But it wasn't until I could stop looking at that context from a perspective of why me? Why do I have a target on my head? Why do people want to treat me this way? Why does it seem like no one sees the good in me? Like, all the why me's. It wasn't until I literally sat down and thought about why me. And when I began to place myself into a space of prayer and literally crying out to God and be like, why me? Because I needed answers. I needed perspective. I needed something. And I didn't quite have a grasp on what it was I needed. I just knew I needed an answer. I needed to know why all of these things happened to me, and why did it seem like the people who are good, bad things always happen to them, and those that perpetuate wrongness and ill actions towards others, it seems like they never get back what they put out into the world. But those of us that try to do the right thing, try to treat people right, and all of that, from that perspective, why is it that all of these bad things seem to come to us? It wasn't until that space of prayer that I began to get a different perspective. And here's the perspective. What I literally heard God say was, it's not about you. It's not about you in the sense that you think it's about you. It's not about any of that. None of this was for you. Now, in my finite mind, none of that made sense. What do you mean it's not for me? What do you mean it's not about me? All of this was done to me. So why was it not about me? I don't understand. It didn't make sense. But it wasn't until I could begin to dissect things a little further, and it wasn't until I began to move closer and further into a space of healing that it began to make sense. It began to make sense for me what God said about the molestation and the sexual abuse and the bad relationships, and all of that wasn't about me. It wasn't until that space. And in that space, what I began to realize is that yes, all of those things happened to me. So I will affirm you in saying that yes, all of those things happened to you. And none of them may have been your fault. And some of them may have been your fault. I can sit and take accountability, number one, for the things that were my fault and that I contributed to. But the things that weren't my fault, I have to take accountability in looking at it from a different space and no longer constantly pointing the finger at others. Number two, you gotta take accountability for your own stuff. And you have to take accountability, number three, for being able to move forward. No one is keeping you in that place of being stuck and not moving and being a victim. No one is keeping you in that place but you. And you have the absolute capability, possibility, tenacity, courage, and chutzpah to move out of that space. But it's going to take intentionality. It takes intentionality with sitting with yourself. It takes intentionality with examining things. It takes intentionality with sitting through all of those feelings, however hard, to be able to see something different. But when you begin to see something different and see it from a different perspective of you no longer being the victim, that and only then is when you will begin to see the purpose in all of that. And that's the place that I needed to be. I needed to be able to see why all of those things happen and to be able to reframe it in a more positive light so that my brokenness can now have capacity for grace, capacity for healing, capacity for purpose, capacity for calling, capacity for anointing. All of those things were there and they were all inside of me, but I didn't have the capacity while sitting in the place of being the victim to tap into any of that. But when you can begin to tap into all of those things that are innately within you, to see yourself outside of a victim mentality, then you can begin to move into your purpose and your calling. This space now, where I've been able to look back and no longer see myself as a victim, but see myself as moving forward, see myself as a sacrifice. Right? It's the same as when Jesus came to the earth to take on all of our sins after the fall in the Garden of Eden. He became the sacrifice for all of the things that we should have gone through, but we no longer had to go through. I began to see myself as the sacrifice for all of the things that I've gone through, that I can now begin to speak to others who have either, one, gone through it, two, going through it currently, or three, before they even get to that space. When I begin to see myself as a voice and not a victim, situations begin to change, circumstances begin to change, but most importantly, my perspective changed. I no longer saw myself as a victim. I now see myself as an advocate. I now see myself as the sacrifice for another to begin to help others move from that particular space. That's when everything collides for the good, right? Now when things happen, I no longer see it as, why did this happen to me? Right? Now, in my humanity, that may be my initial thought. I won't say that it's not. But I'll no longer stay there in that thought process. After that initial thought process, I begin to look to see, how can this be flipped, right? How can I look at this from a different perspective? What is the lesson in this that I need to learn that's going to help someone else? Because what I found out is, while we think we're singular in our perspectives and our victimhood, we never are. We always feel alone, and it feels lonely. But we're never alone because there's always someone out there who is experiencing the same thing at different intervals. But when you can interject yourself into that space or be intercessory in that space, you can stand in the gap for someone else. That's where your power is. That is the best feeling of knowing that all of these things that you have gone through still had purpose. And that is what God meant when he said to me, This isn't about you. So I'm going to say to you, no matter what you're going through, no matter what you've been through, it wasn't for you and it wasn't about you. It's about someone else. So no matter what it is, whether you have the greatest of trauma to the least of trauma, it doesn't matter if your trauma is the same as mine or not. It doesn't matter what your situation is. And I'm not saying that in a flippant manner to negate anything that you've gone through. I'm simply saying that everything that you've gone through has a purpose. But it's up to you to look for the purpose, find the purpose, and exact it, carry it out, execute it. But if you don't, you'll always remain in that place of being broken. But God, in his infinite wisdom, allows us to be broken in a gracious manner, so that that grace that he extends to us, we can then extend to others. And that right there is the whole purpose of this podcast. It's the whole context of being broken graciously, because we're called upon the earth to, number one, solve a problem that God has already seen, that he created us specifically for. And in solving that problem, we have to be able to extend grace to others and to ourselves, and to then begin to graciously help someone else come out of those particular situations, help someone avoid those particular situations. That's the whole purpose. For us to multiply the healing, multiply the grace, multiply the Christ-likeness that we are all to exude. That's the purpose. That's the plan. So I say all that to say, as I culminate this final episode, you don't have to be a victim. Use your victimhood for victory. Your brokenness and cyclical issues absolutely do not define you. They are not your final destination. Tap into it and see what your final destination actually is, and where you should be directing all of that victimhood. All of that energy that you place into being a victim, redirect it and see how far you get. Number 2, healing is possible and it's necessary. Because without digging into your issues and coming to a place of healing, these cycles and issues continue to be perpetuated. And you're stuck and you're stagnant and you're frustrated. And meanwhile, there's a people attached to the sound of your voice, for you speaking out and talking about it, that are lost. Because we haven't come to the place of realizing where we need to be. We haven't come to a place of realizing that there's purpose in that pain. And the third thing I want you to look at is your brokenness is for the multiplication of others. It's for us to pour into others, to exude that grace to others. So if you've not heard anything else I've said out of these 10 episodes, I hope that you have heard that. If you have not listened to any of the other episodes, and this is by chance your first time listening, I encourage you to go back and listen to the other episodes. Again, this is the final episode of season 1. Season 2 will be coming in July. Stay tuned, because I'll be having guests as we talk about health. That's the direction that we're going in for season 2. We're going to be talking about health and the various aspects of it in regards to being broken graciously and all of that. That's where we are going with season 2. So again, stay tuned. Please like, follow, and share this podcast with others. We want to get our numbers up for next season. We want to get our numbers up for next season. Again, thank you for those that have listened, for those that have downloaded, for those that have sent me messages about the podcast. I thoroughly appreciate you, and I will see you in July for our second season. This is Coach T. Thank you again for tuning into Broken Graciously, where we challenge the culture of brokenness by exchanging beauty for ashes holistically with candid conversations, transparency, and practical tips. See you in July.